So you have to imagine the time period. It's 1940, it's the end of the 1930s and 1940. War has broken out and is ravaging Europe. Herbert Marcuse is in the United States, having fled Germany in 1934 already. He's lecturing at Columbia University here as a member of the Frankfurt School in Exile. Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer had brought the Frankfurt School to Columbia as a result of the rise of Hitler. Fascism is spreading throughout Europe, and the United States has actually not yet declared war. The US will declare war after Pearl Harbor in 1941. And what does Herbert Marcuse do? He sits down and he writes a book, an intense, lengthy book on Hegel, Reason and Revolution, which publishes in 1941. He takes on as his challenge the burden of demonstrating that Hegelianism, Hegel's philosophy, does not lend itself to fascism. One of the main objectives of the book is to show that the Italian fascist appropriation of Hegel was misguided and non-philosophical. The Italian appropriation, especially by Giovanni Gentile, a fascist political theorist, philosopher, he argues that that appropriation was not a philosophical intervention worth its salt, and that, moreover, the kind of German National Socialists are themselves anti-Hegelian. So he takes it as his burden, as his challenge, to demonstrate that fascism in general is anti-Hegelian and is not the natural outcome of Hegel's philosophy. So effectively, what Marcuse is doing is he is trying to recuperate Hegel from the Italian fascists in the same way, you can imagine, that other thinkers in France, for instance, such as Georges Bataille, Jean Val, Pierre Klosowski, André Masson, the artist, and others, were trying to recuperate Nietzsche from the fascists in the same period. Actually, they were in France trying to recuperate Nietzsche from the fascists in the period 1936, 1939. They had this project, Acéphale, the headless man, the Collège de Sociologie. And what they were trying to do was to show that Nietzsche was anti-fascist, that the proper reading of Nietzsche was an anti-fascist reading. And in very much the same way, Marcuse is trying to do that in this book. So the first thrust of the book, then, is to argue that Hegel's thought does not feed German fascism. As Marcuse writes, the social and political theory responsible for the development of fascist Germany was, then, related to Hegelianism in a completely negative way. It was anti-Hegelian in all its aims and principles. So that's there on the first slide. This is actually how he closes the book, right? This is the beginning of the last paragraph on page 418, right? It was related in a completely negative way to Hegel. And he does this by calling as his best witness, here on the second slide, Carl Schmitt, who's the political theorist of Nazi Germany, member of the Nazi Party, and a Nazi apologist. Carl Schmitt famously asked the question at the time how long Hegel's spirit had lived in Berlin. And Schmitt's response which Marcuse pointedly quotes here. The very last sentence of the book is that on the day of Hitler's ascent to power, Hegel, so to speak, died. And this is, of course, quoting Schmidt. Schmidt argued that Hegel instead had, as he says, wandered from Karl Marx to Lenin and to Moscow. Right? Now, powerful stuff. And of course, that's the position that Marcuse wants to take here in this book. Now, as for the Italian fascists who had really appropriated Hegel, Marcuse argues that Gentile's interpretation and his appropriation of Hegel, actually, and that of the entire Italian school of thought, was non-philosophical. So he says of Gentile's work and of Italian fascist philosophy, quote, "They cannot be treated on a philosophic level." Of course, that's a pretty damning statement for philosophers. What he intends to show with the Italian fascists is their anti-Hegelianism. He shows Gentile's kind of fundamental motives are, in his words, the strict opposite of Hegel's philosophy. It's by virtue of its being the opposite that it passes directly into the fascist ideology. All right. So that first objective of the book is tied to a second one, directly tied to a second one, and that's to show that Hegelianism leads to Marx and what he calls Marxian social theory, and nowhere else. Now, the idea here is that Hegel and Marx shared the dual concepts of reason and of negativity, leading to revolution. So by contrast, the other intellectual schools that claimed the Hegelian tradition pushed in the direction of what Marcuse calls positive philosophy, rather than the negative dialectic, rather than contradiction. A positive philosophy, he says, that either turns into kind of a dead end in itself, or somehow combined with irrational philosophies of life and nature turns into fascism. Now, one important point here, of course, is that the Marxian social theory is the only legitimate heir to Hegelianism, and the only intellectual strand that productively pushes forward Hegel's thought. Now, you have to understand that there are a lot of risks doing that in 1940 and 1941 here in the United States. At the time, right, in 1941, Marcuse is at Columbia under the auspices of the Institute for Social Research, Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno's institute. Columbia is a milieu that is predominantly anti-communist, liberal, but anti-Soviet. And the Frankfurt School is trying to ingratiate itself with the prevailing sentiment here. In order to get here, there's a long history, but in order to get here, they needed in some way to kind of mask their Marxism and highlight their Germanic social science credentials, right? Which was, I think this is a fair reading of the history. They presented much more as kind of German social scientists than as Marxist theorists, and they kind of slow pedaled that part of their work. And when they were here, they needed to do that, of course. They weren't wearing their Marxism on their sleeves. I've written about this in the context of Franz Neumann, who was also here at Columbia, and who wrote a remarkable book called The Behemoth, which was a description of National Socialism, which, again, kind of underpedals the Marxism to make the critique of fascism more palatable without getting the kind of anti-Soviet reaction. But Marcuse is doing some of this as well in this text, even though he is pretty, even though he puts revolution in the title, right, and even though he's pretty clear about revolution, a lot of the reference, for instance, to Marxian social theory, right, rather than Marxism or Marxist social theory, is in itself a reflection of that idea, right? It's in the tradition of Marx as a thinker rather than in the tradition of Marx as the revolutionary, in a way, right? That term Marxian it kind of connotes something. It's a reflection of a way of softening a little bit. Particularly Marxian social theory is a way of kind of softening the edge of the politics. And so is the reference to social theory. And I would say that another way in which Marcuse is at times soft-pedaling things is by making Hegel seem more liberal than he might have been. And I get that sense reading the text, that there are these times when liberalism is presented as as Hegelianism is presented as adjacent in a way. Adjacent rather than kind of diametrically opposed, or on some readings, a real reaction against liberalism. Okay, so Marcuse is trying to trace a genealogy here, which leads from Hegel to Marx to critical theory. Now, there's, of course, by contrast, there is another genealogy out there which leads from Hegel to the positive philosophy of the historical school and to Auguste Comte's sociology and what was called at the time his positive philosophy. He wants to argue that other genealogy leads straight to fascism and to what he calls the current assault on liberalism. So he writes that the ideological roots of authoritarianism have their soil in the violent reaction against Hegel that styled itself the positive philosophy, right? The destruction of the principle of reason, the interpretation of society in terms of nature, and the subordination of thought to the inexorable dynamics of the given operated in the romanticist philosophy of the state, in historical school, in Comte's sociology. These anti-Hegelian tendencies joined forces with the irrational philosophies of life, history, and existence that arose in the last decade of the 19th century and built the ideological framework for the assault on liberalism. Okay? And the irrational philosophies of life, so that's what's referred to in German as Lebensphilosophie, and it would be, it tends to be associated with thinkers like Nietzsche, but also Dilthey, Kierkegaard probably more on the irrational philosophies of existence, say. But those are the kind of anti-Hegelian forces that, on his view, then leads to fascism. Okay, so it's, in a way, it's what he calls positive philosophy that is the bogeyman here. Okay, and we'll try and figure out what he means by positive philosophy in a moment. Now, of course, Marcuse is, of course, very familiar with the usual account of the post-Hegelian traditions. So he recounts the common way in which we speak of Hegel's legacy. We generally speak about it in terms of, as the heirs of Hegel, we generally talk about, well, there were the right Hegelians like Rosenkranz, and then there were the left Hegelians or the young Hegelians like the Bauer brothers, Feuerbach, David Strauss, and Marx and Engels as in their earliest period, and then they kind of branch off. But he wants to say that this is a far too simplistic schematic, all right? He writes on page 252 of the text, he writes that this is a bit of a too simplistic way to think about it. It's formally accurate, he says, but too schematic. And he says, the historical heritage of Hegel's philosophy, for instance, did not pass to the Hegelians, neither to the right nor to the left. They were not the ones who kept alive the true content of his philosophy. The critical tendencies of the Hegelian philosophy, rather, were taken over by and continued in the Marxian social theory, while in all other respects, the history of Hegelianism became the history of a struggle against Hegel, in which he was used as a symbol for all that the new intellectual, and to a considerable extent, even the practical political efforts opposed. Okay? So that's an interesting claim for a number of reasons. In part because it contradicts in a certain way. It contradicts our usual way of thinking about these genealogies. Right? And in part, this whole seminar is styled as kind of inversions of Hegel, right? We're looking at people who in some way inverted the Hegelian enterprise. Here he's kind of suggesting, in fact, that Marx and Marxian social theory is kind of is the direct continuity, right? Rather, and he's suggesting that all of the others, so the other left Hegelians, Bruno Bauer, etc., are the ones who, in a way, flipped Hegel on his head, right? It's a struggle against Hegel in which he was used as a symbol for all that the new intellectual efforts opposed. And so, in a way, he's challenging a little bit one way to think about these various thinkers. One way to think about these various thinkers, Feuerbach and Marx, is that they were all flipping Hegel, in a way, on his head. That's the traditional reading of someone like Feuerbach, who is one of the immediate kind of post-Hegelians on the left. Feuerbach, you remember, in kind of the spirit of Christianity, what he does is to show that the whole Hegelian enterprise, which was all about this unfolding of consciousness to the point of absolute spirit, of us knowing ourselves and having our shared high kind of intellectual understanding of ourselves, intellectual and practical understanding of ourselves, that almost is divine in a way, that all of that enterprise, which seemed to create this idea of absolute spirit at the end, the absolute achievement, that was actually just Christianity. It was an idea of God, but that what we were doing was projecting kind of our conceptions of self, projecting our own human ideals onto God. And so what he does, Feuerbach, is that he flips that completely and says, no, actually what this whole history is not the creation of some kind of divine, absolute spirit, but it's just our human ideal, right? In an interesting way, so that would have been a flipping. In an interesting way here, Marcuse is suggesting, no, all of those other people, including Feuerbach, were simply a struggle against Hegel, but Marx and Marxian social theory, by contrast, is a continuity, right? This idea that the critical tendencies are taken over and continued by Marx and Marxian social theory. Okay. So, of course, the question we have to ask ourselves is, what is this reading of Hegel by Marcuse which emphasizes reason to the detriment of other concepts like spirit? And how does it actually feed into a Marxian social theoretic worldview? Okay? Because at least in 1941, in this book, and it's not just the title, Reason and Revolution, but it's the whole text. There's no question but that reason seems to be the guiding starting point and the touchstone, really. The touchstone in Hegel and the touchstone in Marx. You can see it, for instance, actually, you can randomly open up the text. I've got it randomly opened up at 253 right now. And it's clear that the social forces at work in this historical surge use philosophy in its predominantly rationalistic form, and the idea of reason might well serve again as the starting point for our discussion, right? Reason was the critical slogan. So there's reason and rationality, which are how he is interpreting Hegel and the development of spirit in Hegel, is something that he then sees in Marx, right? And then that's the continuity, I would say. But it's a very rationalist reading of that continuity. He will define it as critical rationality, critical being very important, right? But that is kind of a particular reading of Hegel and a particular reading of Marx that we might want to interrogate. Okay, and of course, by linking Hegel so directly to Marxian social theory, but so directly to Marx in 1941, right, and paying so much attention to the marks of alienated labor, of alienation, of labor, of the abolition of labor, of the labor process, of the Marxian dialectic, Marx is, as I'm sure you realize, creating a philosophical Hegelian Marxism here, right? Which, is one of the developments that happens in the 1930s and 40s with Marx, in part because it's at that time, in 1932, that many of the philosophical texts of the young Marx are actually excavated and published for the first time. So if my recollection is correct, it's in 1932 that Marx's 1844 manuscripts, his Paris manuscripts, which are his engagement with Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. It's where there's all the discussion of alienation, human alienation, all the discussion of how the worker gets alienated from his work or her work product, how the worker gets alienated from her work, right, which is at the heart of Marx's thought, at least on some readings, but certainly was drawn from the phenomenology of spirit. It's kind of the Hegelian influence. That trend, that tendency is coming alive at this time, and it's alive in Marcuse's work. Marcuse's work is one of these touchstones of the development of a philosophical Hegelian Marxism, Marxian philosophy, say, as a result of the discovery of those earlier philosophical works of Marx. Okay? He's drawing, of course, on the dimensions of Marxian social theory that draw the most from Hegelian philosophy. Again, it's the focus on the alienation of the worker caused by the social division of labor, which is borrowed from the Hegelian concepts of recognition and alienation in the phenomenology of spirit. And he argues, Marcuse argues, that's the work that leads ultimately to what he calls a revolutionary convulsion. Okay, and this is on page 288 of the text. The notion of a revolutionary convulsion that he says ends the system of capitalist society and sets free all the potentialities for general satisfaction that had developed in this system. Marx accordingly calls the communist revolution an act of appropriation, meaning that with the abolition of private property, men are to obtain true ownership over all those things that have hitherto remained estranged from them. Okay? Now, this, in turn, this notion of the revolutionary convulsion and the abolition of private property and the acts of appropriation emphasizes the negative philosophy, emphasizes the negativity, emphasizes the negation in the Hegelian dialectic. But this is a passage from Marcuse where he is trying to connect then Hegel to Marx and to negative philosophy. He writes, "The historical character of the Marxian dialectic embraces the prevailing negativity as well as its negation. The given state of affairs is negative and can be rendered positive only by liberating the possibilities immanent in it. This last, the negation of the negation, is accomplished by establishing a new order of things." Now, so let's talk a little bit about this negativity and this use of the negation. Now, according to Marcuse, now, so you know two things about all of this. I mean, that sentence at 315, the notion of the negation of the negation, okay, is the Hegelian dialectic, right? The Hegelian dialectic starts with some object, it then treats, and then it then immanently, right, liberating the possibilities immanent in it, immanently within that object, there's some contradiction, there's some negation, right? Negation. And moving to the next stage is the negation of the negation, right? Okay. And that creates, he's saying, a new order of things. Okay, so that is simply the Hegelian dialectic, right? Expressed in its formal terms, right? It's, right? For those of you who are very familiar with it, you got this down pat. For those who aren't that familiar with it, right, it's the idea, and I'll give an illustration. It's the idea that you have, that what is inherent is immanent contradictions that lead to some kind of overcoming in which the overcoming was already in those elements before. And that's the critical theory, that's the Frankfurt School notion of immanent critique. Okay? All right, so we have that. Now, what he wants to say, and let me just say that the negation of the negation, okay, is something that, in a way, that Marcuse is willing to accept here at this point. But I think when we look at the preface, which he wrote in 1960, I think that there's a slightly different Marcuse there already that is less willing to accept that any kind of negation would lead to something stable, some new order of things, okay? So just hold on to that, and we'll come to it later when we get to his second preface, which historically, I think, is more deeply rooted in the negation part. But he does, so he's kind of, is a fine line here. The negativity and the use of the negation, of course, is what separates Marx and Marxian theory from the other positivist theories of sociology or of history or of philosophy. The positivism that's associated with Auguste Comte and his courses on positive philosophy, that's associated with Schelling's lectures on positive philosophy, and all of the work that emerges following Hegel's death that took on this notion of positive philosophy and positivity, okay? Marcuse is trying to really draw a distinction between those positive philosophies and what he's interested in, which is tied to reason, but tied to reason understood through the lens of critical rationalism. Critical rationalism that's infused with the negativity that sees its opposite in positive philosophy. Okay? Now, so let's get then to the third task. So if the first task, right, is to recuperate Hegelianism from the fascists, and the second task is to show how it leads into Marx and Marxism, then I would say that the third task, which is a little bit more subtle, but it's in plain sight, is to show the way in which Hegelianism and Marxian social theory call for revolution. And this is, of course, in the very title of the work. The title refers to the core of Marcuse's interpretation of Hegel, namely the focus on Hegel's rationalism and on the task of reason to reveal negativity, to reveal the conflicts in our social condition today, and to reveal the conflicts within reality and within the condition that we are living in, that then leads inherently to revolutionary transformation, or at least the desire for revolutionary transformation. Reason is at the core of Hegel's philosophy from Marcuse, but it's critical reason, right? One that reveals contradictions, oppositions inherent in the present. Those contradictions in our present condition are what lead then to the desire and practice for revolutionary change. Now, he makes this very clear in his discussion of positive and negative philosophy, or more specifically in his discussion of the anti-Hegelian philosophies of positivism, which again he associated with Comte, Schelling, and George Stahl. This is in the second chapter of the part 2 on the foundations of positivism and the rise of sociology, which starts around page 321 of the book. So the critique by positive philosophers of Hegel's negative philosophy offers the clear clearest indication of the threat that Hegelianism presented to the established order. The positive philosophers objected that Hegel's dialectic and his negation, right, or what he called his negative philosophy, attacks things as they are. It negates the current state of things and can only then lead to a desire for transformation, for revolution. The conflicts and contradictions between, on the one hand, the rational, in other words, the evolution of spirit towards some rational ideas of freedom, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the present condition of humans, the present condition of human existence, the current political state, can only lead to political turmoil. Marcuse writes that from the perspective of positive philosophy, and this is at page 325, negative philosophy, it was claimed, tries for the potentiality of things, but is incapable of knowing their reality. The Hegelian dialectic was seen as the prototype of all destructive negations of the given. For in it, every immediately given form passes into its opposite and attains its true content only by doing so. Okay? And so he writes, this kind of philosophy, which is the Hegelian philosophy, right? The critics, who are the positive philosophers, said, denies to the given, denies to our real condition, right? The dignity of the real. It contains the principle of revolution, Saul said, right? And so Hegel's statement that the real is rational, slide 6, right? Real is rational, was understood to mean that only the rational is real. Okay? All right, so what's going on? What's going on here? The idea here, essentially, the point is that Hegel's philosophy was deeply threatening to the Prussian state on Marcuse's reading, okay? And you have to understand, this is on Marcuse's reading because for many readers of Hegel, he was an apologist of the Prussian state, particularly in his later work in the Elements of a Philosophy of Law from 1820. So many readers view that as being simply a justification for the Prussian monarchy, Prussian hereditary, constitutional monarchy. Marcuse is saying, no, actually it was deeply threatening to the Prussian state. And the critics on the right, so I mean, his critics on the left, including Marx, accused him of simply justifying the Prussian bureaucracy, and they focused on the idea in the famous statement in the preface to the Philosophy of Right, they focused on the idea that the actual is rational. Okay, so in other words, the critics on the left were focusing on this idea that he was suggesting that the Prussian state, which was actualized, was rational, right? They were taking kind of half of the equation and simply suggesting that Hegel was simply defending the status quo. But they didn't focus, really, this is Marcuse's point, they didn't focus on the other half of the equation, which suggested that the rational, or perhaps only the rational, is actual. And that half of the equation can be interpreted as threatening the status quo if it's understood to mean that only the rational is real, only the rational should be actualized. Now, Marcuse's argument is that on Hegel's death, essentially, the Prussian state, appointed Schelling to his chair, and others later, such as Dilthey, who gets appointed to Hegel's chair in Berlin later, appoints people who are these kind of positive philosophers who are not interested in finding conflict between what is rational and what is actual. He argues, in this passage here, he argues that Schelling, who was appointed to take Hegel's chair, received an express commission from Frederick William IV, in Marcuse's words, to destroy the dragon seed of Hegelianism, while George Stahl, another anti-Hegelian, became the philosophic spokesman of the Prussian monarchy in 1840. And he goes on to write, in this passage up there, German political leaders clearly recognized that Hegel's philosophy, far from justifying the state in the concrete shape it had taken, rather contained an instrument for its destruction. Within this situation, positive philosophy offered itself as the appropriate ideological savior. Okay? Now, so the basic idea here is that whereas Hegel's negative philosophy pointed out the internal contradictions, the conflicts, the ways in which our condition today was not rational, right, and leading to the need for some kind of overcoming. By contrast to that, positive philosophy instead simply sought to study social reality based on laws of nature and objectivity. It sought to describe reality in its true condition, simply, rather than negating reality because of kind of conflict and contradictions. So he explains, let me see, and this is on page 326. On the bottom of that page, 326, he writes, Hegel had considered society and the state to be the historical work of man and interpreted them under the aspect of freedom. In contrast, positive philosophy studied the social realities after the pattern of nature and under the aspect of objective necessity, right? So the difference here is that the positivists or the positive philosophers are simply trying to find laws of nature that can describe our current condition, right? I mean, and that was really the positivism of the late 19th century and the early 20th century. If you think of someone like Emil Durkheim, right, who was trying to find the laws, the laws of nature that apply to human conduct. He had these ideas of natural laws that applied, for instance, to punishment, right? That punishment would become more lenient over time. These were laws that were modeled on natural science. And of course, that was the idea of these positive philosophies. And of course, if that's the truth about our condition, then our condition is necessarily is fixed and is just the reflection of laws of nature. So there's no way in which you can kind of go against it or contradict it or undermine it, right? It's natural, right? By contrast, Hegel right, as this said, had considered society and state to be the historical work of humans and interpreted them under the aspect of freedom. So if in fact it is the product of free deliberation and rationality, then of course it can be shaped by us differently, rather than if it's just the product of nature. Now, in a way, he's got these. It's interesting the way Marcuse is actually tying that to contemporary positivist social science. Okay, and he does that on page 327, which is on the next page here. And I think it's very enlightening, at least to me, it's very enlightening to read this because it in a way, it theorizes a long-standing objection I've always had to positivist social sciences. So let me just quote two more passages, and then maybe I'll give you an example that strikes me. So the first, at the top of the page, 327. In this way, positive philosophy aimed to counteract the critical process involved in the philosophical negating of the given, and to restore to facts the dignity of the positive. So this is kind of at the core of the difference between positive philosophy and negative philosophy. But the tie here becomes really important because he ties it to positivism more generally. And he does so in the next paragraph. That this is the point at which the connection between positive philosophy and positivism, in the modern sense of the term, becomes clear. Right? Their common feature, apart from their joint struggle against the metaphysical a priorism, is the orientation of thought to matters of fact and the elevation of experience to the ultimate in knowledge. So basically what he's trying to suggest is that there's a continuity between all of those early philosophies, positive philosophies, Comte, etc., and modern, contemporary, 1940s, kind of positivist social science, right? And so that the critique of positivism, that there's actually a critique of positivism here. And the critique is that basically it's trying to tell us what reality is like and how things function. It's trying to exclude the question of how things should function. It claims to exclude the normative, but in reality, it's always imposing an interpretation in neutral guise as positivism of how things should function. It masks the normative, but always kind of has it nevertheless. It's imposing interpretations that are intended to be purely descriptive, but that in fact represent normative assessments. And you should think here that normative, right, what the world should be like, is synonymous to kind of the critical in critical rationality. So, just to give an illustration of this, I remember when I used to teach at the University of Chicago, and I remember once attending, I would regularly attend the, Richard Posner and Gary Becker had a econ workshop that was all about rational choice theory, basically. And I'm sure you all know what rational choice theory is, right? It's predicting how people are going to act rationally and building models based on what is considered rational behavior. And I remember once being in this workshop, and Richard Posner was referring to people acting rationally, and we were just describing curves and kind of points of where, supply and demand meet and whatnot. And he kept on referring to this as being rational behavior, the rational behavior was a downward sloping demand curve. Basically, in other words, when price goes up, demand goes down. So when the price of a commodity goes up, people want to buy less of the commodity. That's simply a downward sloping curve. Price goes up, you get a downward slope in terms of quantity. And kept on referring to this as, this is, and to a certain extent, that is the basis, or that's the way that they would talk about rational behavior in a rational actor model. And I remember it driving me crazy because, in fact, that's not rational to have a downward slope demand curve, right? It just means that people are being elastic to price, that there's a response to price. That's all it means. I mean, all it means is that there's elasticity in the curve. If there's no elasticity, the curve is flat. It's a straight line because you can change the price all you want, but the behavior is going to stay the same. And I remember at some point going ballistic and just saying, look, you can't talk about that as being rational behavior, right? It's not rational. It's not necessarily rational to buy less if the cost goes up. So, for instance, you can imagine a situation where the price of bread is going up, and it's totally rational to be buying bread because the price of meat is skyrocketing, or the price of potatoes is going through the roof, 10 times worse, right? So actually, the price of bread's going up, but you're going to buy more bread because the other prices are going up even more, say, right? Now, what does it mean to be rational? But anyway, even there, what does it mean to be rational? But certainly you can't say that any one of these curves is rational, and yet kind of the entire logic of the supply and demand curves are about rational behavior. And I remember going, I was just like, you can't call that rational, okay? You can say it's negative elasticity. It could be positive elasticity, whatever, but you can't call it rational. Becker actually agreed with me. But the point was that everybody was using a normative term as if this was the proper behavior, right? Because obviously rational behavior is proper behavior. Irrational behavior is not proper behavior. I mean, there's a loaded valence to those terms, at least within the framework of that particular economic model and analysis. And it was being masked, and it was being presented in some way as pure positivism, as just a description, but it was in fact masking. So there's this way in which positive science tends to do that. It tells us that what people are doing under the guise of a purely descriptive science, it actually loads it with ideas of what we should be doing and how we should be behaving. And in that sense, it justifies the status quo. And I think that's exactly what Marcuse is saying when he is attacking positivism on page 327. The positivist opposition to the principle that the matters of fact of experience have to be justified before the court of reason, however, prevented the interpretation of these data in terms of a comprehensive critique of the given itself. Such a criticism no longer had a place in science, right? In the end, positive philosophy facilitated the surrender of thought to everything that existed and manifested the power to persist in experience. Okay? Positive philosophy, he writes at the bottom of the page there, was going to affirm the existing order against those who asserted the need for negating it. Okay? On the next page, on page 328, there's this great passage, because this where Marcuse ties the notion of positivism to counter-revolution. and ties negation to revolution. And so he writes, the political aims thus expressed by positivism link the positive philosophy with the doctrines of the French counter-revolution. Comte was influenced by de Maistre, Stahl by Burke, right? And this notion of counter-revolution actually is something that Marcuse would develop in 1972 in a book called Counter-Revolution and Revolt, which was a very engaged short tract, which was written kind of during the height of the Vietnam protest, where he was already arguing at the time that the kind of American reactionary forces were a counter-revolution taking place in the United States, something that I think is very interesting and helpful when we think about what's going on in the United States today. Okay. All right. So, to make this all very concrete, and as you know, that's my goal, is always to make things kind of understandable, completely understandable, completely realizable. I want to give you an example of the notion of negative philosophy versus positive philosophy. And I think that this example is helpful. I kind of alluded to it last time, but here's one way, or at least a case to think about. In the United States, right, we tend to believe, and particularly at the time in the 1940s, we tended to believe that we are free, or that we have a lot of liberty, in part because of our choices as consumers. So with regard to everything, automobiles, food consumption, dietary needs, whatever it is, particularly at the time when you would think back to the contrast between the United States and the Soviet Union, where there were limitations on selection of goods, on the provision of goods, and so that's one place where we would have a strong notion of liberty. We go to the grocery store, we see the shelves filled with items for which we can freely choose. It gives us this sentiment of free will, free choice, freedom, particularly by contrast to other countries. Now, Hegel's concept of contradiction or negation right here serves to find within that sense of liberty the internal contradiction. The negativity of the approach, and this is Marcuse's emphasis on negativity, the negativity of the approach is to search that form of liberty and to find within it its opposite, its contradiction. And we can do that, I think, in this context, when we realize that the grocery store, perhaps, that we're not so much exercising free will in our shopping or in our consumption as we are being controlled in our choices by the mechanisms that have produced the choice of items on the shelves. And it turns out that large corporations pay grocery stores to have their products placed in prominent places. Book publishers pay bookstores to have their published books on the front desk, right? When you go into most bookstores, when you go into most commercial bookstores, I'd like to think this is not the case with book culture here, which tends to very beautifully kind of have the different books that the different people at the book culture like to read there. At most commercial bookstores, it'll be the publisher that's going to pay them to put the new book that they just published on the front window, on the front desk, so that people read that book. It's the same thing for grocery stores, right? What is most accessible, right, eye level on the shelf is product placed. Product placement is something that is acquired, purchased, paid for, okay? So the truth of the matter is that we're not so much exercising free will when we go to the grocery as we are making choices between items that have been imposed on us by a mechanism that we haven't chosen for reasons that aren't related to our own individual welfare or well-being. The large corporation pays to have its product prominently placed at eyesight, at eye level, and for all we know is stuffing those highly processed foods with sugars or other additive ingredients that make us want to buy them, again, despite the fact that they might harm us. Now that right there then is the internal contradiction. That is the negation, okay? That's the negativity. That's saying, okay, take your concept of freedom, right, and search for the negativity. Don't search for the positive philosophic laws that are in the real. Search for the places where there's tension. And that's the transformation that, on Marcuse's reading, Hegel has in mind when he talks about one concept leading to its opposite or its antithesis. In simplistic terms, it's the idea that where we thought there was freedom, in fact, we discover non-freedom, coercion, a rigged system that we're not freely choosing, that's forcing itself on us. Now then, to overcome that negation, right, and this is where someone might talk about the negation of the negation. To overcome that, we need to get to some higher stage that, in a way, incorporates elements from the previous stages. In this situation, with this example, it would mean something like trying to realize or instantiate a political economy of production, say for purposes of consumption, that would ensure that the products that we can buy at the store or that we can obtain, right, for our consumption are products that satisfy our freely chosen standards regarding perhaps something like organic produce or fair trade produce or products of cooperatives or locally sourced or local produce, say, right? So that we would think, like, what is it that we actually wanted, right? Maybe we wanted local organic produce from cooperatives. It turns out that we might be much better off in a situation where there's a lot less choice of goods, but where those goods are produced by local farmers in a sustainable way, say. Now that higher notion of freedom then is more capacious. It's not just a question of free will or free choice, but of our freedom being manifested within the larger organizational, economic, and political system that would involve, say, again, organic local cooperatives. Freedom is actually living in that space, right? It's not just free will, it's actually living in a society that is organized along, and here we might say, rational or critical rational principles. Critical rational principles perhaps of cooperation or different modes of production or something like that. Yes?
But Professor, haven't we just arrived at what Marcuse describes as the position of Kant regarding authority? I.e., wouldn't it be much better if we could impose society as it ought to be, right, positively, through some form of shared authority? I mean, isn't that what it would mean if we replace the apparent freedom of free choice with the apparent freedom of, like, kind of properly organically sourced food in the grocery store?
Yes. 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 So, I mean, that example and the kind of the references to the revolutionary convulsion and the reference to that sentence that I had earlier, which is kind of like the new social order, right, is, I mean, I think it has that element of it has a strong element of rationality, and it has a strong element of, well, it feels as if it has almost a strong element of finality. And that, of course, would be a problem for a real negative philosophy. That moment of kind of like negating the negation and overcoming, I mean, there are two ways to think about it. It's problematic if it is in any way terminal. And then I think you've got the problems that you've identified, particularly, right? It's particularly problematic if it's terminal, if we think that we've gotten to an end state, right? And in a way, that is the problem that is associated with readings of Hegel that would suggest an end of history, right? That you get to a stage where, you know, we have accomplished everything that spirit could lead to. That's the problem that is the Alexandre Kojève's reading, Notions of End of History, and that's a problem. I think that where Marcuse ultimately goes, and you see it even more in the 1960 preface, is to a place of radical negativity. So it's not clear that in 1960, and this is also more associated with Adorno's book, Negative Dialectics, right? That there isn't that moment. You don't get to that moment of the negation of the negation. You don't get there with Adorno's Negative Dialectics. And sometimes when I read the preface here from 1960, I feel as if that he has gone in that direction, right? But yeah, it does create either the problem of end of history and some absolute stage, or the other answer would be, or one answer would be, well, no, you don't go to that moment of the negation of negation, which is a little bit more of kind of Adorno, or you just think that, which I would favor in a situation like this, you just think that these are temporal overcomings. These are moments where we reach some next stage, but there's going to be another contradiction that arises, and that's going to have to be the case. But it doesn't mean that it has to. But you have to get there first for there to be that contradiction. So in other words, this idea that you would be in a society that were organized, a sustainable economy organized in this way, that's not the end state. There would be some other contradiction that would then push us further. And we didn't talk about Beauvoir much, but I was talking about Beauvoir a couple of weeks ago in Paris. I mean, in part, I think that's what's so appealing from my perspective to thinking about this. Beauvoir does a critique and overcoming, but nevertheless remains in a state of some binarity that was a world of improvement, but then that gets critiqued by Judith Butler and queer theory that, pushes us further. And there's a way in which I don't think that we can really know those critiques until we've gotten to that stage. And it's possible that, trans theory is pushing queer theory further. But you don't really know those next stages until you've gotten there and you're experiencing and living that quote unquote, resolution of the contradictions. So one way of reading this would be to allow for that, which means so this notion of liberty here, which is obviously it's not a notion of negative liberty, it's not a notion of being left alone, it's some kind of notion of positive liberty, ultimately, but that would lead to further conflict and then further movement. Okay, but anyway, what's clear is that on Marcuse's reading of Hegel's philosophy, it's the negation that leads us to demand or ask for that transformation of reality, right? If we give Hegel the benefit of the doubt, so if we take this to be the Hegelian position, then what Marcuse is suggesting really is that reality right now, the reality of that situation of the grocery store, whatever, with product placement or whatever that example you want to use, is not what could be called rational. The rational would be that other world of local, sustainable economic systems, and that we would get the idea of that from the tension, from the negation, from the contradiction. So that's at least one way, perhaps, that Marcuse is reading this idea that the rational is the actual. It's not the present existing condition, but that the actual could be the rational. All right. And I think that's one way to interpret, the core theory of this book on reason and revolution, which is reason, the rational, is that moment and that movement of negating, of finding contradictions that then propel us to a higher stage that we consider rational. A term which actually I have a lot of problems with. So I have a lot of problems with the term reason and with rationality, because it tends to be a normative term that's really loaded with presuppositions about who is the rational person. Tends to be, well, we know, but nevertheless, that is at least the reading that Marcuse is proposing. Okay, now. Now, Hegel, of course, in his later years, was not himself a revolutionary, for sure. And Marcuse points to this in this passage, and he's quoting Hegel's last writings. This is on the English Reform Bill, one of Hegel's last writings on the English Reform Bill. And this is a discussion around page 248. So this was a reform bill that was being proposed at the time. So this is about 1830. Hegel dies in 1831. And it's pretty clear that from Hegel's text that he's opposed to the reform, which would have given more power to Parliament as opposed to the monarch. And he opposed that because it was likely, in his view, only to embolden and strengthen the people, kind of the mob, which would have brought about revolution rather than reform. Hegel writes that the reform bill would likely strengthen an opposition, he writes there, an opposition at the end, building itself on a program hitherto foreign to Parliament and feeling itself unable to expand its influence among the other parties in Parliament. So a program that might be induced to seek its strength among the people, then instead of achieving a reform, it would bring forth a revolution. So there's clearly in this text a distancing from revolutionary action by Hegel. He's distancing himself in a way from the French Revolution as well, from what he calls the abstract principles of the French Revolution. And he's anxious about the possibility of revolution. And so it's fair to say that in his later work, here as well as in the different versions of the philosophy of right, there's a more conservative tendency in his politics at the end of his life. And this is something that Louis Althusser emphasized, wanting to really sever that later part of his corpus from the earlier one. But for Marcuse, the logic of the Hegelian argument does lead to revolutionary transformation, revolutionary fervor. It does lead to Marx, or Marx in social theory, rather to any other political theory at the time. And I think that's how you have to understand the notion of negativity and the idea of critical reason, of criticality, of critical theory, of the dialectic, of the negative philosophy, of the negative dialectic. All of that leads to social transformation. By contrast, positive philosophy simply tries to explain and in the process justifies the current condition, the status quo. All right, now, hopefully that gives you an idea of what he's doing in 1941. One of the questions is how this relates to what he was doing in 1932 in Hegel's Ontology and the Theory of Historicity. And it's a complicated question, in part because the text is so obscure. It's pretty clear that what he's trying to say in 1932 in a text that is much more of a Heideggerian kind of Hegel is that there's something ontologically fundamental, ontological in a Heideggerian sense, to the historicity of human life, and that this lays a groundwork for Marcuse's later emphasis on, possibly, right, on perpetual negation, or what we find, I think, at least in the preface, right, the perpetual negativity that leads to the construction of the social world. So in effect, it kind of negates the possibility. If you find that there is something essential of a historical dimension or historicity, if there is something essential in our human being, then in effect it would negate the possibility of an end of history, of a final absolute stage, or an end of these kind of dialectics. So very quickly on the 32 book, it's pretty clear that it's written under the influence of Heidegger, who he was reading intensely and working with at the time. Hopefully Seyla Benhabib, who translated the work into English and wrote the introduction, will be able to kind of contextualize it for us. As she suggests, there's some confusion as to what exactly the status of this work was, whether it was in fact his habilitation, which on the continent is the equivalent of a kind of second doctoral thesis or second work of research that generally is submitted in order to give you the authority to supervise doctoral research. So on the continent, you basically have to not only write a doctoral thesis, but then do a second intensive research work, which possibly this was, in order to then have the authority to oversee other people's doctoral work. I think that, but as Robert Pippin discusses in his article, which I shared with you this afternoon, and if you want to continue in this vein with the 1932 work, I think Robert Pippin's article is also really helpful to understand it. As he suggests, though, this is the text that Adorno relied on to admit or invite Marcuse to become a member of the Institute for Social Research. So there's a sense in which, at least what Robert Pippin is suggesting, and I think this is true of Seyla Benhabib's introduction as well, that it somehow had this element of critical theory in it that was consistent with and pushing the critical theory of the Frankfurt School at the time. I think I'll suggest why in a minute. Professor Benhabib includes this passage from a letter that Marcuse wrote that helps kind of place this whole book in context, where he writes, this is from July 28, 1931. He writes, "It's true that a longer work of mine on Hegel will appear this fall. It is an interpretation of the logic and phenomenology of spirit as foundations for a theory of historicity." So he's describing his work, right? He says, "The Hegel-Marx question is not explicitly addressed, although I hope that this interpretation will throw some new light on this connection. Neither does this work contain a critical discussion of Heidegger, nor is it intended to do so. Rather, the whole is a necessary preparation for articulating the fundamental nature of historical happening," right? The fundamental nature of historical happening, which to a certain extent is not radical for any reading of Hegel, right? I mean, it's pretty well understood that there is a deeply kind of historical nature to the work, to Hegel's work, which we see throughout, from the phenomenology of spirit all the way to the philosophy of right, to the passages about history, world history, etc. But somehow, what Marcuse is trying to do is to say that historical element, that historicity, that whatever it is that is historical, is actually part of our being and our experience universally all the time as humans. Okay. Now, I think one aspect that's particularly interesting about this 1932 book is the way that it focuses on certain passages in Hegel's phenomenology of spirit rather than others. Because this is almost at a time when, G.W.F is going to be focusing on the master-slave dialectic, the Lord and bondsman dialectic, and kind of changing the way that people interpret Hegel, think about Hegel, understand Hegel. And here, actually, Marcuse is focusing on a different section, which comes later. He's focusing on a later part of chapter 5. The Lord Bondsman was in chapter 4 of the Phenomenology of Spirit. Here he's focusing on something else. You can see that particularly in chapter 23 of the book. Marcuse is focusing on the chapter, The Spiritual Animal Kingdom and Deceit, or the thing itself, in the Phenomenology of Spirit. So he's not focusing on the struggle between the Lord and bondsman, but instead on something about the intersubjective kind of constitution of a shared world. And that in itself is interesting, right? It's about making a world together through labor, but about how that constitutes us making a social world together. And it's important, in a way, to get that sense of what it is in Hegel that becomes your matrix to read Hegel and understand the world, right? What is it that you're actually focusing on? Which passages are you focusing on? Can be very telling. And Benhabib has, I think, a good discussion of this at page 27 of her introduction. At page 27 of the introduction, where she talks about this fact that the problem that he's focusing on, right, is the intersubjective constitution of a shared world, a social world of objects as well as of actions. So that might be helpful to your reading. Now, the question then becomes, how does this contribute to, critical theory? And Robert Pippin has a good discussion of that. So let me go to this next slide here. So Robert Pippin is talking about the relationship between the 1932 text and the 1941 text. This is on page 195 of his article. And he's trying to show the differences, but show the continuity. What he writes is, in terms of the continuity, what he says, most clearly, what Marcuse wants to preserve and defend in Hegel is the central place given in his system to negativity, the power of thought and action to reject and transform any putative, positive reality, and the impossibility of understanding any such reality except in relation to this possibility. And so this kind of picks up that question of whether or not there can be a final transcending or a final negation of the negation, as he writes. In Reason and Revolution, he again rejects in Hegel all those aspects of his thought that tend to suppress or overcome the negating potential and thereby its decisive consequence, which is the notion of motility. In this work, he also rejects Hegel's final rational synthesis, repeats his charge that the philosophy of right and the philosophy of history are the most undialectical, least defensible parts of Hegel's system, and stresses again that there's a stark truth in Hegel's strangely certain announcement that history has reached its end, but it announces the funeral of a class, not of history. So the idea here is that in the 1932 work, and there's continuity with Reason and Revolution, with a resistance to thinking that there would be any end to the negativity, that it would continue. And I think that you see that pretty clearly. You see that pretty clearly in the 1960 preface to Reason and Revolution, which is on page 12 of the preface. I think that you get a slightly different take on reason and on his centering of reason. I think that there's more skepticism about reason, in part because there is more emphasis on pure negativity in some sense in this work. This is, in the preface. This is called A Note on Dialectic, and it's really all about negation, the power of negative thinking, the world contradicting itself, and my sense is that as he is getting older, and headed towards works like One-Dimensional Man, which comes out, I think, in 1968, so 8 years later. He is focusing more and more on, or hammering in more and more the idea of simply sticking with the negative, the power of negative thinking, which it seems is what he is so adamant about in that period, which of course is a much more revolutionary period. It's the late 1960s, early 1970s. There's the student uprising, of which he was very influential, and the anti-Vietnam War protests going on at that time. Okay, so I'm hoping that this gives you a background sense of Marcuse's work.